Hello learners, welcome to our session today. I am your instructor CPA Aringo Frederick. In our class today is a continuation of what we started earlier on. My good students, today I want us to talk about present value of an annuity. Remember in our last class we had looked at present value of a lump sum. So today I want us to talk about present value of an annuity, It would be very important for us to remember the concept that we did when you are looking at annuity. Very important to recall what we said about annuity when you are looking at compounding techniques. So annuity, ideally, it refers to the periodic payment. It refers to the periodic payment or receipts. This refers to periodic payment or receipts for a given period of time. 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 And that means that at this point, assuming I'm talking of for 5 years, I am receiving or I am paying certain amount of cash flows, or I'm paying certain amount, a fixed amount, as at the end of each period. I'm paying a certain amount or receiving a certain amount as at the end of each period for 5 years. That is what you what we are looking at when you're talking about the concept of annuity. Now, looking at it on aspect of present value, because remember our main agenda here, we want to determine the equivalent of present value of our future cash flows. This is what we are looking about, the aspect of what? The discounting techniques, right? So how will we go about determining the future, or rather determining our present value for future cash flows, or rather on future cash flows? And at this point, I am receiving or we are paying them periodically. At that point, this is the best time for us to have in mind the formula of determining the present value interest factor annuity. It will be very important for us to recall or to understand how we will determine the present value interest factor annuity given your rate and the number of period. Given your rate and the number of period. So if you can recall what we did when we were looking at the annuity but under future value, the same concept is going to apply at this point. So this time round, for present value interest factor annuity, my good students, we are going to talk of the following. We are going to talk of 1, we less our 1 plus r, which is our rate, raised to power negative period. We divide by our rate. This will give us our factor. That will give us our factor. That will give us present value interest factor annuity given a certain rate for a number of period. If you can recall, that's why Mwalimu is saying that is more the same as what we did. Because if you can recall, when you are looking at the future value interest factor annuity given a certain rate for number of period, we are talking of 1 plus r raised to power n minus 1, we divided by r. This was a factor under what? The future value interest factor annuity. That is what we are looking at. That is what we were looking at. This time round, we are looking at what? We are looking at the present value. So this is what we did, and this is what we want to do. This is what we did. So this is what we want to look at in our session today. So also in this session, it will be very ideal for us to understand how to use our present value table. Because recall, we had talked about the present value table when we had tackled the aspect of lump sum. We were receiving this once as at the end of the period. What if I am receiving it on a periodic basis? What will you be expected to do? To understand the concept clearly, my good student, I want us to put this illustration down. This illustration will cement the concept that we want to drive today. This illustration will cement the concept that we are looking at today. And the concept that we are looking at today, my good student, this is a concept, this is a question. Talk about our illustration question. Talk about our illustration question. Illustration question, we are going to note and say our illustration question. If we were asked to calculate the present value of 150,000 shillings, calculate the present value of 150,000 shillings, calculate the present value of 150,000 shillings at the end of each year, at the end of each year, at the end of each year, for 5 years, at the end of each year, for 5 years, for 5 years, for 5 years, at an interest rate, at an interest rate, at an interest rate, at an interest rate of 10% per annum, at an interest rate of 10% per annum, at an interest rate of 10% per annum. What will we do? We are looking at what? We need to calculate the present value of 150,000 shillings at the end of each year for 5 years. As at the end of each year for 5 years at an interest rate of 10% per annum, my good students. So what are we going to do? First of all, one important element that we should understand, we know very well that yes, to determine this, to determine the present value, of course, you are going to take, this case, you are going to take, to determine the present value, my good students, you are going to take the future value, correct? We multiply by our factor, which in this case, we should be talking of 1 plus r, or in this case, we are talking of 1 minus r, 1 minus, talk of 1 minus into bracket, 1 plus r raised to power negative n. Of course, we divide by what? We divide by r. This is what will give us our future, or rather our present value, right? At this point, let us determine our factor first of all. Let us determine our factor. Let us determine our factor. And to determine our factor, my good students, we can clearly see that my factor, talk of the future, talk of the present value, talk about the present value interest factor, annuity, given a rate of 10% for 5 years, for 5 years, what will we have? For 5 years, for 5 years, what will we have? This is what we are going to consider. We are going to take 1, okay, we less 1 plus r, our r is 10%, so allow me to take 0.1 raised to power negative n. Our period here is 6 years, right? Our period here is, we are looking at a period of not 6 years, but a period of 5 years, a period of 5 years, a period of 5 years. We divide all this by what? We divide all this by 0.1. So this should give us what factor? I want us to see the factor that we'll be talking about. So our factor here, we will be talking about 1, first of all, that is the same as saying 1.1 raised to power negative 5. That should give us a 0.6. 1 minus answer, divide by 0.1. Clearly, I'm getting 3 points. We are getting 3.7907, or at times you can take it as 3.791. So this is what you are getting, being our factor. So to determine our present value, therefore, it will be very simple, right? Because this is what we are going to do. This is what we are going to do. We are going to take my future value, which is 150,000. We are going to multiply this one by 3.7907. That is what we are going to multiply. So we'll be taking 150,000. We multiply by 3.7907. So that should give us a figure of how much? I'm getting a figure of 568,000. 605. 605, 605, 605. So at any given point, if we were to invest, for us to earn that interest, for us to earn an interest of 150,000 at the end of each year for 5 years, at this point you're saying we should invest how much? 605. So this is how we can work out our present value. This is how we can work out our present value, receiving or being paid as at the end of each year for a certain number of years. What if, my good students, we were to use our table? How will we go about our table? Because maybe I know you'll be asking, Mwalimu, you say that there's a way that you can work out using our table. So how will you use our table to determine this factor? Let me share the table with us here. This is our table that I want us to look at. You'll always be given this table, of course, in your examination. We are looking at present value of an annuity of interest per period for a number of years, right? In our illustration question, we are looking at 10%, 5 years, right? For 5 years. 10% each year for 5 years. So look at our first column, I'm having our period, then the row, I'm having our percentages, right? So I want to look at this factor, 10% 5 years. So how are we going to go about it? I want us to go to our row, look at where we have our 10%, then from 10%, go with it downwards to the period of 5 years, to a 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 period of 5 years. So for 5 years, you can clearly see we have 3.7908, which is just the same that we've gotten there. So in this case, I'm having 3.7908. So that is a figure that we have determined at that point. That is the figure that we have determined at that point. That's the figure that we have determined at that point. So basically, my good student, that is one way that you can work it out. That is one way that we can work it out. So you just use your table, and I've clearly shown you how to use your table. Look at your percentage called a row. We have 10%. 10% go downwards to where we have the number of periods that we are looking at. Suppose I was looking at 6 years, I'll just go for 6. Suppose I was looking for 12 years, I'll just go to 12 years. But remember, we can also use our formula, because remember in our table here, like assuming you are given 11%, what will you have done? 11% is not on the table. You see, 11% is not on the table. So it will be very important that also for us to be able to understand our formula correct. It will be very important for us to be able to understand our formula correct. So that is how we are supposed to work it out, my good student. That is how we are supposed to work it out. That is how we are supposed to work it out. That is how we are supposed to work it out. That's how we are supposed to work it out. Again, another concept that I'll also want us to understand and also be able to grasp it very correctly. What if this time round, my good students, we are looking at our present value and I am given irregular cash flows? It is not a fixed amount that we are receiving as at the end of each period. What are we supposed to do in the event that I am looking at irregular cash flows and we are told that I am dealing with annuity? So long as we are being told that we are doing or we are receiving that as at the end of each year, as at the end of each year, as at the end of each year. How will we go about it when we are looking at what? When we are handling this concept. So this time round, I want us to look at a scenario, my good students, whereby we're having irregular cash flows. We're having irregular payments, or we're having irregular receipts. Well, how are we going to work it out? How are we going to work it out? So This time, we are looking at the situations where we do have irregular cash flows. We are having irregular cash flows, irregular cash flows, irregular cash flows, irregular cash flows. I want us to look at a situation whereby you are considering irregular cash flows. How will we go about it? That's the most important question that we should understand. So, consider this illustration question, my good students. Consider this illustration question. Consider this illustration question, where in this case we are told that calculate the present value, calculate the present value, calculate the present value of 20,000 shillings expected at the end, or rather calculate the present value of the given cash flows expected at the end of each year for 5 years. Consider, in this case, you are told to determine the present value, 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 determine the present value of 20,000 shillings, of 20,000 shillings, determine the present value of 20,000 shillings, determine the present value of 20,000 shillings, expected at the end, expected at the end of each year, expected at the end of each year for 5 years, 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 determine the present value of 20,000 expected at the end of each year for 5 years at an interest rate of 10% per annum. At an interest rate of 10% per annum. That is one question that we need to consider. Then at this point we are having determine the present value, determine the present value of the cash flows given, of the cash flows given, determine the present value of the cash flows given at the end of each year, at the end of each year, at the end of each year for 5 years. At the end of each year for 5 years. At the end of each year for 5 years. At the end of each year for 5 years. So, in this case, the first case I'm given a fixed amount. Right? Which will be very easy because on that case, we are going to use this formula directly the way it is. Directly the way it is. But in this case, I'm given, determine the present value of the cash flows given at the end of each year. Mean at the end of each year for 5 years at an interest rate, at an interest rate, at an interest rate, at an interest rate of 10%, at an interest rate of 10% per annum. And the cash flows given here, my good student, I'm given, say, year 1. We have year 1, or rather we have years. We can talk about the amount. We can talk about the present value factor, present value factor, present value factor, present value. I'm given 10%. So years, maybe you're having year 1, year 2, year 3, year 4, and year 5. Amount, the first one maybe I'm having 50,000. Talk about 30,000. Talk about 40,000. Irregular, talk about maybe 20,000. Talk about maybe 25,000. We're having irregular cash flows. We are having irregular cash flows. So, how will you determine that factor, my good students? To determine our factor, we can clearly see I'm having for each year. So, what will be our discount amount that we'll be receiving? So, this is how we are going to work it out. And I want you to understand this concept very well and very clearly. So, the first thing that we need to do, we know very well that I'm considering for each year. And I'm having different or irregular cash flows, right? So, year 1, we are going to take the same formula of ours where we are going to consider our factor, which in this case will be our factor, which in this case I'm going to take 1 plus the rate, which is 10%, so 1.1 raised to power negative 1, 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 1 minus answer, we divide by 0.1. Just the same case as we normally tend to do it. So in this case, we should be talking of what? We should be talking of, I should be talking of 0 point. We are saying we are taking this case. That should be aspect to do with 1.1 raised to power negative 1, year 1, raised to power negative 1, that is year 1. 1 minus our answer. Then we divide by our rate, which in this case our rate is what? Our rate is 0.1, right? Our rate is 0.1. Our rate is 0.1. So in this case, we are going to have 0.9091, right? How will I consider the second period? The second period, it will be very easy, my good student. I can either work it out again using the same case, but in that case, we'll be wasting a lot of time if I'm using our calculator. If we are using our calculator, after I've determined the first one, the second year, take your answer, divide by 1 plus your rate, which in our case we are having, divide by 1.1. Which in this case it will give me 0.8264. Year 3, answer divide by 1.1. I should be having, in this case I should be having 0.7513. Divide by 1.1 your answer. 0.6830. Year 5, the same concept. Divide by our answer. We divide by our answer. Divide by 1.1. 0.6209. So that the moment you do have that case, now it will be very easy, my good student, because the first one I'll just be taking my 50,000. We multiply by 0.9091. In this case, I should be talking of 45,455. Talk of 30,000. We multiply by 0.8264. We should be having 24,792. 40,000. We multiply by 0.7513. We should be having 30,052. 20,000. We multiply by 0.6830. We should be having 13,660. We should be having 13,660. Talk about 25,000. We multiply by 0.6209. We should be having 15,522.5. Then we sum it up. So that should give us a figure of plus 13,660 plus 30,052 plus 24,792 plus 45,455. So you should be talking of a figure of 129,481.5 being our present value, summation of all that, So basically you find that, again, you'll find this is a concept as the one that we did under present value. So basically, this is what will be expected to do at any given point whenever we are considering these cases, So to that point, my good students, that should mark the end of our session today, whereby in our next session we are going to talk about the concept of present value annuity, but with infinity, perpetuity. So that's what we are going to handle in our next class. So to this point, thank you so much, and let us meet in our next class. Thank you.